And that music means we have convened a book circle of the elders of bookishness. And we will now be reading from part 5 of volume 1 of the Accursed Share. Or we'll be talking about it. So we get to the contemporaneous period of when this book was written, which we need to remind ourselves was the late 60s. Just so we have context. 1960s. I guess it could be the 1860s, but Bataille wasn't born yet. And we have 2 sections under part 5, the present data, a section on Soviet industrialization and a section on the Marshall Plan. And it does look like there is at least 3 sources for this data as opposed to just one. So we have that for today. All right. Are we alive?
I think so.
Okay, yeah. All right. How do we feel about this one?
Is Bataille a crypto Khrushchevite?
I feel like he might be, actually.
Yeah. I mean, so one thing that I think it's weird because the copyright thing on this says 1967, but looking it up, I believe that this originally came out in French in like 1949. So it's a bit earlier.
He talks about Truman like being the president.
Yeah. So it's a little earlier than I think. Volume 2, I think, is writings that go all the way through like until his death, basically. But like, yeah, I don't know. I thought that this is kind of the weakest, or like, I don't know. It's less interesting to me than the earlier parts, in part because I feel like what he's kind of trying to justify and do here actually seems to, I don't know. I felt like it cut against the grain of what he had set up beforehand. Like it felt like he was kind of trying to walk back the implications of some of that stuff he was doing in order to kind of just give a soft defense of the USSR kind of thing. But it's not, it wasn't really clear to me why he feels like he needs to be doing it for his theory, really. It just kind of felt like he wants to be like, well, we still need this other kind of society, so I'm not going to side with people that are like super critical Marxist critics of the USSR, but I'm also not going to be like too defensive of it. But I don't know.
I mean,
and hard to avoid confronting this in his time and in France at that time, especially, right? Like you're going to have a take on the Soviet Union and Marxism.
Yeah, I mean, it's part of the Popular Front in France, and that. But I mean, it is interesting because it's also contrasted with the Marshall Plan. You know, these are the two. But he does seem to like, if there's a method in here, it is like pick true to kind of sort of contemporaneous systems or events, put them side by side, draw a conclusion. Right, that seems to be the way these chapters work, and I'm trying to make sense of why he's pairing Soviet industrialization a la high Stalinism with the critique he does tend to have of the excesses of high Stalinism with the Marshall Plan. Like, what do we make of that? Particularly since it ends the book.
Well, that's why I made the crypto Khrushchevite comment there, because I think he sort of contrasts them because those are what the two different camps are doing. And also, you know, he sort of like gets at like there's got to be some sort of peaceful coexistence and peaceful competition, right?
Mm-hmm. Which, how would that? I mean, knowing what we know about France in the late 40s, early 50s, how would have that been received? I mean, it seems like almost tailor made to piss both sides off. Like,
Yeah, not critical of the Marshall Plan enough, I suppose.
yeah. I mean, I can't see how Gaullist would feel about this, for
Yeah.
example.
Yeah, I mean, his
Well, they weren't
attitude.
really in power at that point, though. De Gaulle
That's
was
true.
a background figure.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean, his like approach to the Marshall Plan is also kind of weirdly like wishy-washy, where he's sort of like, well, this is an example of spreading the excess and stuff, but he kind of makes gestures to like, but who knows? It's still in American interests. It could still be, that he kind of tries to do this like, this is an example of a certain kind of liberatory force, but it's still subsumed to a certain kind of logic that isn't good. But he never really like lays out that much more about that, because he kind of just tries to talk about it in this sort of abstract, circulation of stuff kind of way.
Mm-hmm.
Like it kind of feels like his point is often being like, look at these individual countries with their individual plans. We shouldn't try to like overly criticize what they're individually doing, because the problem is this bigger system-wide thing, which is kind of true, but it doesn't feel like that's actually substantial enough to address some of the stuff that he's kind of trying to get into. It kind of feels like it becomes a bit of a hand wave.
Yeah, it feels like this is like tacked on for like contemporary relevance, but also in such a way that like almost undermines the prior rest of the book, and B, it's wishy-washy as fuck, if I'm completely honest. Like I was actually surprised because I had heard that like Bataille flirted with Marxist-Leninism and fascism and didn't really side with either one. But I'm reading this, I'm like, does he side with anybody really? Yeah. Like it's for a guy who's like pro-human sacrifice. This feels remarkably like, well, I kind of like the Soviet Union, but I also think the Marshall Plan's okay. Neither one of them get to this larger sex and death problem that I'm really obsessed with.
Yeah.
Have a nice day.
And the bit on the Soviet Union in particular, it's really weird because his defense of it kind of reads like people that are 21st century Marxist-Leninists when they talk about actually existing socialism, where a lot of his stuff is sort of being like, well, yeah, there was a lot of stuff that was bad. Some of it can be blamed potentially on the actions of individuals, but a lot of it is just sort of the process of needing to industrialize, and like, how can you not expect there to be this much upheaval and tumult when you need to industrialize as a nation? But I'm like, it feels really hard to take that at face value from Bataille when he had like a whole chapter talking about like how bad that logic is in the context of like the bourgeois world. Like in the previous chapters, like part of his whole thing is about like that he's against the logic of accumulation in that way. So it's really weird giving him this kind of like banal, tame, like, well, they kind of just had to industrialize, like in order to live in the modern world state. And you're like, but dude, like, this is your whole, you were just giving an insane over the top, like cosmic critique of this. And now you're just kind of being like, oh, it's historical conditions or something,
I mean, does it feel, I am speculating here, I do not know this, but it feels tacked on.
It could be. I really don't know much about how this was drafted. I'm still going through the limits of the useful, which is that kind of semi-earlier draft one, and I haven't seen if he goes into this more.
Yeah, I have that book too, and I haven't read every essay in it, so I want to see. But it just feels so out of step with everything else in this book. I mean, it just feels so like, now we get to contemporary society. And both sides are kind of bad, but ultimately kind of right. What? Like, it's just, dude, you were talking about how we needed human sacrifice cults earlier. Like,
yeah, It does, yeah, it feels a little bit banal. Like, it feels a little bit like he's just taking this kind of moderate. Ironically, it kind of feels like some of those people that tried to be just sort of like weird moderate humanists being like, oh, well, there's certain things bad with both sides, but what we really need to do is just find a way that this kind of multipolar world system can collaborate without, producing war.
Yeah, because we don't want
Which
war,
is kind
but
of
we
like
do
with
want
the
human
Khrushchevite like
sacrifice.
stuff, it has that feeling to it.
Well, I mean, it just
And
feels like we don't want war, but we do want human sacrifice. Like, okay, I don't understand here.
I also read it as slightly optimistic by his standards because he took for given, like, oh, living standards are going to continue to rise through all this stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, they did until they didn't. Like, and I guess it is hard to hold people accountable for not seeing that, but it does feel like not quite liberal consensus of the early 50s, but it feels like almost that. And that is so weird coming out of this guy in this book. Like, it's actually hard to talk about because it's, reading it, I'm like, okay, cool. I mean, I guess we can look at some of the stuff in here.
Well, another thing that sort of reminded me of Lacerdo there is he's like, well, you have to make your concessions to nationalism too.
Yeah. Well, it does seem like post 84, post Euro communism failing, European Marxist Leninist Dungism is what it feels like. Like, which, in some ways is the milkiest toast of milk toast communism. But also the stuff with the Marshall Plan even makes that a little bit like. So yeah, I don't know, Gerard. Maybe he's crypto Khrushchevite and a crypto proto dungist. I mean, like, I just don't know. Like,
Yeah. I feel like he's kind of just doing that thing in the context of France of just sort of trying to walk a line of like being generally anti-totalitarian. And so he doesn't really want to say like either of these states themselves save us, but so long as like material conditions improve, that will be a check on like the excesses of the past. Well, he likes excess, but a check on the destructive accumulation of the past if people's like actual living standards and stuff improve, and if there's tension between these nations, that will prevent one side from like just becoming this kind of pure accumulation regime, and like that tension opens up. There's that other French guy that talks about totalitarianism that was like, I think one of the members of the he used to be part of the socialism or barbarism group, and he kind of I feel like he went in a direction similar to this, that I wonder if it's just sort of Bataille is just stuck in that position of being like, well, I don't really like the Soviet Union, and I don't hope that the Soviet Union steamrolls France, but I also don't necessarily want to just become like a colony of American foreign power. So maybe we can just trust in this kind of like strategy tension thing going on between the two powers, so long as both of the powers are involved in this kind of like building infrastructure and sending out resources around the world kind of thing.
It's like structural global economic potlatch.
Yeah, I think that's what he's kind of secretly hoping, but he's kind of not really saying that directly.
Right.
That he's like, if these two world powers continue to like develop their living standards and be, use the accumulation that they've developed, then they're kind of the two kings or whatever that are going to try and outdo each other, and the rest of the world will basically just have the opportunity to kind of be the consumers of that energy that's going out.
Yeah.
So the totalitarian thing is interesting because I think we think this was written in 4950. Raymond Aron's like The Opium of the Intellectuals doesn't appear until 1955. So, but maybe that's sort of a current that is bubbling under the surface in French intellectual life. but he does, take time to sort of, give some differences between the Nazis and the Soviets at the same time.
Yeah, this is not like one of those French Cold War or Raymond Aron Millie Mouth. Totally, it's just because he's not like. I mean, he's comparing the Soviet Union to the U.S. Marshall Plan, not the Soviet Union to Nazi Germany, which is actually a little bit different. I just read this and I was like, did this get censored? Like, or did he like get told to chill out? Yeah. Or what? Because I'm kind of expecting when we get to volumes 2 and 3 in the Big Blue Book, which is way longer and also posthumous, that maybe these 2 chapters become irrelevant.
I do think from kind of skimming it, I mean, there's sections of that book that I'm pretty sure are written after like the secret speech and more context on terrors and all that stuff, that I think he does have stuff where he goes more in depth on critiquing Stalin, and maybe even doing a little bit more stuff where he kind of says like, here's my theory of Marxism now, here's my theory of Stalin, and look how I actually think that Stalin doesn't understand Marx. I think he does a little bit more of that than he does in this book. That's just based on kind of glossing certain parts of it, though. But yeah, I do kind of wonder if because I think that volumes 2 and 3 have writings that are going at least past 60, like up to around 68, around the time that he died, but it would have been through the 50s.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I'm kind of but it's weird that it's like who cares enough to be censoring him, because he's not like a member of the French Communist Party that I know of, and he was actually in circles that were more like, not necessarily like ultra left, but he was in circles that were critics of the Soviet Union's, I mean, even the surrealist circles had more ties to like Trotsky and stuff later on, and there's a specific group that I think Limits of the Useful talks about, but it also says, even then he would join it and then he would never sign on to anything official, so he wouldn't sign off on any explicit statement saying that he hated the USSR or whatever. But it is sort of just like, well, who does he think he is, like he's appeasing here?
Yeah, because it feels like an appeasing move, but I just can't figure out where it's coming from. Consider the rest of the book. Like, I mean, I still don't understand why this guy would have ever been a Marxist, to be completely honest with you. Because his theory seems so removed from that.
I guess it's partially just that was being in radical circles at the time. Like that was, it was either that or be a Catholic reactionary or a fascist.
I mean, we can see him becoming a fascist, frankly, but I can't see him being a Catholic reactionary. He likes weird shit too much. Yeah. And not the Catholic weird shit, like really weird shit. The sun has a giant anus, human sacrifice.
I think he was actually one of the people that helped Glenn Shou become less of a Catholic reactionary, right? Because he was just like, look, I'm into this stuff too, but it can go in much weirder directions.
Yeah.
But
yeah, I do feel like I need more context for what produced these last 2 chapters, because it just seems so different from the rest of the book. I mean, I guess we could talk about one of the last, like the last section of it, and I'll just read a part of it. It's the dynamic piece section. We only need to bring a clear principle into political judgment. If the threat of war causes the United States to commit major part of the excesses to military manufacturers, it will be useless to speak of a peaceful evolution. In fact, war is bound to occur. Mankind will move peacefully towards a general resolution of its problem only if this threat causes the U.S. to assign large share of the excess, deliberate and without return, to raising the global standard of living, economic activity, thus giving surplus energy produced an outlet other than war. I mean, this almost sounds like, what is weird about this is also one of the few times where he might be kind of an orthodox Marxist, and that like he's an overconsumptionist. I mean, not an underconsumptionist. He's an overproducerist here. Like, he does seem to think that overproduction leads to potlatch, but that's also why we need stuff like war, and maybe the détente between the Soviet Union and the West will lead to.
Yeah, he seems a little bit like an orthodox Marxist of this time who's trying to like bring in some of the Keynesian stuff and be like, maybe there is a way that we can like take advantage of the scale of production that we have now to kind of, you know, in order to avoid what would normally be the crisis of war, like kind of.
Yeah.
I just read it as like a general peacenik thing, as like, well, if you spend all this money on armaments, they're going to get used.
Yeah. Although, ironically, so far that actually isn't totally true. Like,
yeah.
Like,
but that was the general, like, you know, argument especially at this time in things like campaign for nuclear disarmament and everything.
I mean, to be fair, I mean, I also don't know that it's wrong, because like, the timeline for not screwing up on nuclear weapons and whatnot is nearly infinite. So, it just seems, I just really do have it hard to square with, you know, Mr. Aztec Empire was good. It seems so. This does feel to me like, it feels so normal and reasonable. It actually feels out of left field because he's saying it. And it's hard for me to talk about, because it's just like, okay, so we don't want war and we want a standard increase of living, but then that cut against the whole like potlatch as big, enormous waste stuff that we were talking about for the rest of the book. I mean, it really does. I mean, at minimum, it feels like he's pulling back from the central thesis of the book in the last 2 chapters. Does anyone disagree with me on that? Because that's just how, I don't know how else to read what's happening on this.
Yeah, I feel like there is something contradictory about this. I mean, his whole project is hard to say it's like that consistent, but this in particular feels like there's something tugging against the logic that he set up. Like, I get that he's trying to build up to this idea of like, maybe there is a sort of like, maybe we now have the opportunity for, like a global potlatch or a global expenditure of energy and resources. Now that, you know, World War II is over, there's a reason to want to avoid war in the future. There's, you know, massive states with the capacity to be doing this. I get that, but sort of like, I don't know. It just feels like the kind of examples of consumption and sacrifice and, you know, that he's been building up on, it feels like the implication would be that this is not sustainable,
right?
Or that this is something that would break down and require a more, you know, explosive kind of consumption that he's been valorizing so far, or a more ritualized or something, like his like focus on the sacred or whatever. It just feels like it's not, it feels like he's covering up some of the implications of what he would be going into in other anthropological examples or something.
Yeah, it does. Well, this might end up being a short episode, because I'm like,
I also feel like I read this last part like back before you had the crisis and stuff that forced us to put it on pause. So I admittedly didn't get the chance to reread it, so it's not as fresh in my mind.
I reread it this morning, and I was just like, okay. So it's my response wasn't that different than yours. I was like, I'm gonna have a hard time talking about this one. Go ahead, Jared.
I thought there was one interesting contrast, though, because I mean, he sort of acknowledges socialism in one country, but he says, like, I think he uses the example like, well, you know, if the USSR expands, like Chile could join it. or something like that. But I thought he sort of contrasted it and saying that it's in a better position because the Nazis were too nationally focused. And I don't know.
That is interesting, actually. I mean, it's such a small part of this, but it does seem like, yeah, we're making the concessions to nationalism, but nationalism is still kind of bad, okay? It does seem to be his position. Which, okay, fine. Sometimes that sounds like me, but...
Yeah, that's the circle that many Marxist Leninists, well, and many on the left have tried to square, but that especially comes up with Marxism, Leninism.
Because we're like, well, actually, I don't think socialism in one country is possible forever, but I don't think anything in one country is possible forever. So
it does kind of feel like he's doing this weird thing of being like, yeah, there's stuff to criticize in these nations, but you shouldn't base your critique on what they're doing as nations, because then you're being too nationalistic. And you need to be more internationalistic, so you can't criticize them on the basis of what they're doing as nations. You have to look at like the international flow of energy and the things that they're mutually like propping up between each other, and that, like, yeah, it does feel a little bit like because he keeps doing stuff where he says like, well, the national point of view is like irrelevant or like misleading. And I think that he's trying to do that in the way that he often talks about like, oh, when we look at consumption as like an individual, it looks like this, but we're talking about consumption on like the level of, you know, this bigger cosmic system. And I feel like he's kind of trying to do a similar move where he's like, well, yeah, there's this stuff that appears this way if you're looking at just individual nations, but you can't really, and yeah, we can make these certain critiques of them as individual nations, but that doesn't really hold up as the main form of critique, because you have to look at it from this like broader systems thing. And then when you look at them as they are in the system, you have to have a complete paradigm shift in terms of what we're actually critiquing, which is like, I guess, kind of true in certain ways, but also I think he is using it in a way to sort of bury other problems or to kind of not deal with other things.
It definitely feels that way to me, and I guess that leads me to what we can spend the little, next 10 or 15 minutes, so that we at least hit 45 minutes of an episode on, and talk about what do we take away from this first volume. Like, we got a little bit on Marx, we got a lot on the Mexica, we got some weird stuff on Lamaism, some of which wasn't even true. We got Bataille's weird gloss on Marcel Mauss. We have the solar anus, and we have the laws of general economy should be energy. And then also maybe a detente between the Marshall Plan and Soviet industrialization will lead to world peace somehow. How do we add that together into a coherent thesis? And should we even try? Because I do think, there's an argument to be made that we shouldn't try with volumes 2 and 3 because they were never finished. But this is a finished book signed off by Bataille. So, like, it is, it's got structure and whatnot, sort of.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't really know that there's a takeaway that's a hard, like systematic, or like, I don't know. It does feel like it's almost just a sort of like, here's just an approach, like try to account for all this consumption stuff in addition to production. And I'm kind of sympathetic to the way that he does it, because it's just so bonkers that it does sort of just like, it gives you a bit of a kick in the seat of your pants. But yeah, I don't know. Because the thing is that there are people who like take this kind of thing and they try to go and semi more systematized, even when it's like still too many concepts and it's weird in French. Because I mean, like you see in early Baudrillard is clearly inspired by this and his critique of commodities and value, and like where he's trying to say that like Marxists don't understand use value and value because they don't understand the thingification of things or whatever. It's very Bataille inspired, or like even those kind of Deleuzian or neo-Deleuzian things on kind of weird French cybernetics on energy, and they go into ecology and stuff. It feels like they're trying to do something that's a bit like Bataille or inspired by Bataille, but more, yeah, like with specific concepts and ideas of how you identify and label and categorize things and approach it. But when I read that stuff, my eyes glaze over. Like, I find it way less interesting and less like provocative, or I mean, even just trying to, like, if you gave me if I was in school and I was told, like, here's your essay prompt for the end of the class, and I could either write something trying to analyze it. If they give you like some sort of anthropological example and they say, like, analyze this in the style of Bataille or one of these other thinkers, I would probably feel more like stuck with the other thinkers than I think I would with Bataille. Like, if I was trying to granularly break it down into this kind of like typification of systems and labels, and this thing is this kind of thing and this thing is this kind of thing, versus trying to just kind of get a feel on the situation and try to look at the relation of consumption and energy in this kind of more general way that Bataille opens up. I don't know, like, there is something more appealing to me about this than some of these other hyper formalized versions.
Well, it is. I mean, it gets at some of the stuff from anthropology and critical theory, but it is also not the French critical theory of the Saban of the 60s and 70s. It's just not that. And even though it seems to have directly led to that, and in which case, fuck you, Bataille. But so people know how I feel about all the fun of Saban philosophy and where all that went up. But it is way more interesting to read. I mean, it is infinitely readable, but it's almost a thing that makes it confusing because it's just like, okay, so what am I supposed to do with this exactly towards the end? Even though I read it, I understood it. It was fun. I mean, the last 2 chapters weren't fun, but most of the book was fun. Maybe more fun than serious, and it does try to, unlike, say, Deleuze and Guattari, it does try to root something in some kind of notion of history. Deleuze and Guattari kind of sort of do that, but not really.
Bataille has too much weird topsy-turvy Hegelianism in him to like not care about historic development.
That seems pretty clear. But ultimately, I kind of struggle actually with why Bataille is so loved on elements of the left, if that makes sense. Because I'm reading this book, I feel like I've had this response a lot lately. I mean, I put up with my Patreon series on the Brenner debates where I'm like, did the people who like this actually read it very closely? I mean, I believe they read it, but did they read it closely? Because, like,
I just like him because he's weird.
No, it's
I like
fun.
a lot of his like art stuff and his surreal and the Asifel. I mean, I've got an Asifel tattoo, like, but
I have all of his novels, including The Story of the Eye back there, and
Yeah.
Asifel. I mean, like, I like Bataille, but I wouldn't want to base a theory on. Like, I like him as a form of. It's like going to a punk cafe in the 1990s and listening to a weirdo. And now that I think about it, that's probably how I was first exposed to Bataille, even. Is like somebody probably had like eroticism and death, and we were at a punk cafe in Athens, Georgia, and somebody was ranting about it. And that's how I got first exposed to Bataille. In fact, I'm pretty certain that's how I first got exposed to Bataille. And he also feels like that, but somehow, like, it does feel weirdly of its time, but more readable than a lot of the same stuff from this time period.
Yeah, I do think one of the appeals is, well, I think in a way the people that are kind of the most boring about Bataille are people that do that, where they try to just be transgressive all the time, and they're like, so they just try to be like, I'm like Bataille, I'm super transgressive. Versus,
like
I think
early
what's
Nick
most
Land.
interesting, what's most interesting about Bataille is when you're able to be someone who's like, I don't know, like you're a Marxist or whatever, that you're like, I'm trying to be a good, level-headed Marxist. I'm trying to analyze the world, And, you know, like Bataille is a kind of a little person that you can read that's like, okay, this guy's like opening up, even if he's kind of incomprehensible or weird, if you take him seriously, you're at least able to be like, okay, well, maybe he is pointing out certain blind spots in this kind of roundabout, odd way. And he's so hard to systematize or reconcile back into like your normal Marxist thought that he kind of keeps being a little bit of a, you can think about him and he'll be a bit of a gadfly to your own comfortable concepts and stuff. And either you can be someone who just goes, at the end of the day, this guy isn't that important, there's not much you can do with him, or you can at least try and just be like, well, what about this point that he makes? Even if he's not empirically super sound, it does open up this kind of weird direction that maybe we have to try and accommodate or work around, even if it can't, you know, I don't know.
I feel like it's like reading. It's not that I agree with you that the people who just try to be transgressive don't do a lot with this, but it feels like he's a popularizer and a synthesizer of such weird shit. Like each one of these chapters is basically a particular gloss, usually having to do with potlatch or extreme surplus and how you get rid of it. From one person's ideas that he's then applying and trying to draw some general theory out of. And it is very readable. It is not very rigorous. And once we got to the end of the book, I was like, it's also kind of self-contradictory. And I've also been reading some of the stuff out of the Limits of the Useful. And some of that stuff is actually better.
Yeah, I kind of like some of that more. Because it feels a little more upfront,
right?
Honest about what he thinks he's trying to do,
right? And weirdly, it doesn't proclaim to be a system of everything the way this does. Like this does.
Yeah, I do think that Volume 2 and 3 is going to be a little more fun in terms of that kind of wild and crazy Bataille.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think there's just so much more stuff in it.
Yeah.
I mean, just looking at, I'm just going to read this to preview what we're going to be doing next. We're going to be doing this massive tome, and then we're going to be doing Stanislav Slim's Summa Technologicae, which will also be interesting, completely different. But I do like just reading some of the stuff in Volume 2 and 33. So Volume 2 is the history of eroticism, which, by the way, did Foucault steal his history of sexuality from Bataille's history of eroticism? One wants to know. But so we get stuff like the prohibition on incest, the natural object of prohibition, transgression, and if you've read more Bataille, the history of eroticism, the composite forms of eroticism, if you read like eroticism and death, and you start like, okay, we're back in Bataille's actually his more normal concerns, even though they're weird. But then we get into chapter 3 on sovereignty, and I think that shit's going to be wild.
Yeah. Because that's what ties into his like weird attempts to try and figure out like a theory, semi-theory of like community. And, you know, this idea of like, how can you have a community that's not bound by kind of exclusion or domination, but is more open, but you also need to have some sort of like sovereignty that's defined by like excess and, you know, uselessness. It's very, very strange.
I mean, when we get to, but what's even weirder is like two whole parts of sovereignty are about communism.
Yeah.
Which is not what you'd normally think when you're discussing communism. I mean, like when you get into, what is it? And I haven't read this yet, but sovereignty, feudal society, and communism. And then we got these subsections. What is the meaning of communism? The collapse of feudal societies and the great revolutions. A world of denied sovereignty, sovereign within the limits of the Soviet society. Part 3, the negative sovereignty of communism and the unequal humanity of men. And then equivalence and distinction. And then we end up, it's still about communism, the literary world and communism, but it's all about Nietzsche from that point on. It's like Nietzsche and communism, Nietzsche and Jesus, Nietzsche and the transgression of prohibitions, in the present age of sovereign art. Like I have a strange feeling this is gonna be fucking wild, like really wild. But and I have read essays from it, but I've never sat down and like read the whole thing from cover to cover. So I think it's gonna be interesting, and maybe it'll maybe by the time we get to the sovereignty section on communism, we might understand what he sees in the Marshall Plan and in Soviet industrialization. But I have a strange feeling that no, we're not going to understand that actually. Like we're going to be like, I think, and I've heard other people say this, we're going to be looking at this and going like, what does he think communism is?
Yeah.
Like, not what a lot of other people think. So yeah, I think it's going to be interesting. I'm kind of excited to get to the bigger volume of the Accursed Share.
Yeah, me too.
But it does make it clear that this book was really tightly, like, it is structured very specifically in the way the next one isn't. Like every section is 2 chapters. Every chapters are paired together as like as case studies in time, and it is actually fairly well polished in that regard. But I think it also makes the ending just not work. So yeah, that's where I am on this. Closing thoughts, Gerard. What do you make of this book?
Well, I mean, I think trying to get at the rational kernel, shall we say, of Bataille or something is. I think that there's a sort of, like, obviously Marxism has its crisis theories, but I still think that there's a little something lacking that makes Bataille appealing for people on the left of like, well, how do we explain all of these different societies, both capitalist and pre-capitalist, and how they just end up doing these things that seem wasteful, and maybe those things will catch up with those societies, but a lot of these societies seem to be able to do such wasteful things for, extended periods of time and continue to reproduce themselves. And so what's that all about? Because I don't think, a lot of Marxism can really explain that very well. And to me, that's the allure of Bataille.
Yeah, I mean, part of the problem I have with Marxism, qua Marxism, is unless you're talking about capitalism, you're always talking about things from like the mode of production, maybe not with even the relations of production clarified, and everything's like flattened out to some form that you can apply. You can try to apply to every society as long as you don't actually try to apply it to every society. And then once you do, it all starts to get real sketchy. And when people do that, they actually start inventing new categories that weren't there before to make it all work. And Bataille's not trying to do that. It does seem like Bataille is looking at Marxism and going like, well, you don't have a good theory of mind and you don't have a good theory of waste. And I do think there's something to that. Although Bataille is just like Marcel Mauss on acid. It's like Marcel Mauss, but maybe incest is good, and so is human sacrifice. But war is bad, except when the Aztecs do it. Like,
yeah.
It's just.
I mean, I think that there is, I mean, obviously Bataille is like uncomfortable to engage with because he's so bizarre and he's intentionally trying to be taboo and discomforting and stuff. But there is something, I think, to, I mean, he doesn't think he's an anthropocentric like theorist. He thinks that he's doing some sort of anti-anthropocentrist argument, but like, I think that there is something a little appealing to some people about his attempt to be like, well, you have to engage with the subjectivity of death and sex and enjoyment and how that ties into this whole like what it means to consume, not just in this kind of like, I'm thirsty, so I drink a Coke, I'm hungry, so I get a burger, like kind of, but in this more, I think that there is something that people, I mean, certainly people who are more like artisty, weird transgressive types, but I think that there is a lot in Bataille that maybe if you stripped his French concerns with literature and the Aztecs and like all that stuff, but if you kind of just took the main themes and talked to a lot of like average working people, quote unquote, like I think that you could get a lot of people that are like, yeah, there's a sense of enjoyment that comes to wasting stuff. There's a communal element to wasting stuff. Like I think people can grasp onto that.
Mhm.
And it does say something about, cultural dynamics, about the idea of being in community with other people, about having stakes in things, that I think that there is something in Bataille that you can kind of start looking at, even if he doesn't, theorize it very super explicitly. Not that I think, the focus on like festivalism and carnival and all that stuff, I think we've seen from the 70s onward that like overemphasis on that also doesn't really work. We can't all just be like situationists trying to have big festivals and orgies and eating and stuff all the time and think that that just produces revolution. But like, I do think that there is something about like, there's a weird sense of stakes for people that does in part come from this kind of relationship of consumption, relationships of death, relationships of sex and stuff, and pleasure that play a large role in how people kind of develop kinship and care about each other and maintain group bondings and stuff. And I think it's interesting and not something that I think there's a reason that Bataille is one of the first people that gets people to think about that and more seriously, even if it's because it just feels so uncomfortable and how blatant he is in just being like addressing the taboo and stuff. And I realized one of the things about this is that I actually like that Bataille almost never really cares about building concepts, which makes him vague, but it also, in a really interesting way, it's hard to read this book and then be like, you can't read this book and then be like, now I'm going to apply Bataille's concepts to things around me, which is a bit frustrating in some ways, but I find it a bit refreshing because I think I've been through too many books and met too many people that will read one author who defines all these lovely little concepts and then defines everything around them by just applying all those concepts all the time.
Oh yeah,
So
but they're in my
and that
comment
gets
section all the time.
yeah,
Like-
and it's nice that like so you can meet someone who will say like, "Well, have you read Bataille? You haven't considered this," but you can't really just be like, "No, you don't understand this because Bataille's concept X defines it as this." Like he doesn't do that, so you're kind of forced not to sprinkle like terminology as analysis, or like you can't be like, "I have an explanation for this. The explanation is concept Y. Concept Y explains this thing because I've applied it to it." Like you can't really do that with Bataille because he doesn't really care about systematizing his thought in that way. And I kind of find that a bit refreshing because even with thinkers that I do like who come up with concepts like Bourdieu, I get tired of meeting Bourdieuian fans who all they do is try and label something as this kind of
Distinction and
cultural
symbolic-
capital, or this
Cultural
is this
yeah.
capital, and you're like, I don't think that the point of this analysis is just to have a big bunch of terminology that you can drop on whatever and expect it to explain everything for you. And I think Bataille is a bit of a refreshing counter example to that, where you can get what he's saying, but there's no easy way to just be like, and this is the framework that I drop onto the world. It kind of forces you to just stew on it a little bit.
My way of reading him is he's a productive weirdo failure, but like, and I don't mean like as a failson, like his project doesn't actually work, but I wouldn't have gotten into Potlatch and Marcel Mauss in my late 20s if it wasn't for Bataille. Like when I do think about this, like he was my introduction to like Potlatch and surplus expenditure anthropology and stuff like that, and it shaped the way I approach anthropology, honestly. Even though reading him now as opposed to when I was 19, he seems like a lunatic. But a lunatic in like an interesting like way that gets you to think about stuff, which is, I guess that's why these last two chapters like so stuck in my craw, because I'm like, this is not interesting. Everything else you did, I don't know that it was right, but it was least interesting. Like,
Yeah.
This is probably somewhat correct, but Jesus Christ is boring, especially compared to the rest of the book. I mean, it's not super long. I mean, the other things that you have to give Bataille, like some, like if Deleuze and Guattari rewrote this book, it would be like triple the length, and would have a lot more strange words in it that they made up. Like, and reading him now, I do see where a lot of the French post-structuralist concerns, he does like, he's proto a lot of that, you know, like you know, his history of eroticism, it really does feel like, well, Foucault, I see what you're doing, you know. And his use of Marcel Mauss, I mean, you don't see, I think you don't really get a whole lot more from that until you get into the anarchist anthropologist of the 80s and 70s and 80s. So he is kind of prescient. I mean, it is like you're reading a madman who also happens to be on the pulse of where things might head, but in such a bizarre way you don't know what to do with it.
I think it is one of the things that's interesting about him is that he's ultimately, I mean, he has an academic degree and he works in the library and stuff, but like, he's not really an academic in the way that, you know, other intellectuals in France around him are. So reading him is interesting because he's kind of putting his finger on the pulse of a lot of this and raising these questions about where trends in the French intellectual tradition are going, but he's doing it as this kind of external weirdo.
Right.
So you get a really strong sense of how French intellectual life, people were just talking about this stuff. And not all of them were academics. Some of them were just artists and weirdos like him. And he's kind of just presenting the most insane melange of all these questions and discussions that are going on. And you just get a really weird vibe check on the whole era, I think.
I think he is like, can be a productive gadfly, but as we were speaking about earlier, I think he was still subject to certain pressures, which, you know, the last section was evidence of. And I don't know, does he ever talk about French colonialism?
No, I was trying to look that up because I was like, it feels like he would be someone who had opinions about, I don't know, Algeria or something.
Yeah,
You'd
but
think
I
it'd
couldn't
come
find
up.
anything.
Like, he's in the time period where that would be super fucking relevant.
Yeah.
Like,
and I mean, like Blanchot did that whole thing where all the intellectuals signed the thing saying that they didn't support the Algerian war and went on trial and stuff. But I think he was dead by the time that happened. But yeah, I was kind of surprised that he doesn't have any sort of commentary I've been able to see where he even talks about Algeria or French colonialism more broadly.
For a guy so shocking, and for a guy who was clearly attracted to extremophile politics, he is remarkably. Look, weirdly, I think you could read this and like not, you wouldn't come to any like immediate radical opinions from Bataille in the 40s or 50s, even though this is so out there. Like, it does feel like he's actively maybe eschewing, but the broadest, most possible sense of contemporary politics. Like even when he talks about, you know, the Soviet Union and the Marshall Plan, France comes up, but not as much as you think it would. Like, it's, and that's interesting to me. It would kind of be like reading someone writing about radical politics now and them like not mentioning the US's role in Palestine and how and like what we should feel about that. I mean, he barely even like makes a whole lot out of World War II, and we got to remember that this would have been written during and right after that.
Yeah.
Well, so I mean, like that's actually kind of a big deal in and of itself. Like, you're not talking about World War II that much, but this is 1949 when this is like drafted. You know,
I mean, he makes a few comments about Nazism in the last section, but like I feel like that's a fertile ground for him to study.
Right.
Just about the psychology and their conception of excess and their ideas of the nation and everything like that.
It's almost like he avoids it so he doesn't have to like be caught on paper having an opinion on it or something. I don't know. I mean, but I find that strange I do find it strange given how audacious he is on everything else. Like that's what I find interesting, because it does seem like there's an Algerian and there's a World War II shaped hole in the center of this book.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what to make of that either. But
well,
go ahead.
I don't even think the Algerian uprising has even started. I don't even think this, and I don't even know. Well, I think some Vietnamese resistance has started by 48, 49.
Yeah, you start seeing the Vietnamese resistance about 48. It's full blown from 52 to 1979, but like,
yeah.
So maybe I'm hoping maybe it comes up in this. Maybe that'll answer more of our problems. This is volume 2 and 3.
I have looked up just general Google searches of like George Bataille on colonialism and things like that, and I really haven't been able to find anything that discusses any sort of primary source on it. Like usually you'll find like a special collection of stuff where you occasionally just find people commenting on Bataille's theory and then tying it to like, does it have anything to say about colonialism, or you get people talking about like the theory of necropolitics and how that is loosely inspired by certain things in Bataille, but it's also more of a theory of colonial control and stuff like that.
It feels like necropolitics has always felt like colonial control, a little bit of Bataille to add some edge to it, and a lot of Foucault.
Yeah.
Like, I am looking forward to the next book. So,
what were you saying,
Jared? I was also going to say, I don't think whenever Sartre had his debates with Bataille, you would think Sartre would be like, well, you support French imperialism and that, but that's not in there either.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe I should go back to his biography and see what I can glean from that, because maybe it will help if I'm like periodizing in his life. But he just seems weirdly, not even pro-colonial, just weirdly silent on it. Like, and I was trying to like think of that when I was also thinking about his reading of the Mexica and the Mexica Empire, and I'm like, okay, so he doesn't seem to be like, I would love to know just what he thinks about what imperialism actually is. Is it a form of this excess? Like, what is going on here? I am left with more questions than I had answered. Let me just put it that way. I think that's probably the best way to say it. Well, in a month, we'll read, let's say, actually, these chapters are pretty short. So let's say we're going to go to volume 2 in the Big Blue book, and we're going to read preface plus introduction plus eroticism and the reflection of the universe. So all part 1 plus the preface, and the Accursed Share volume 2 and 3, the Zoan edition. Are there any other editions of this? I know there actually are other versions of this, but
I don't think there's other 2 and 3s.
Yeah.
I don't know that there's anything that's like more recent than Zone editions, really.
Yeah, the Zone editions are nice. So.
Yeah, they're pretty nice. I am annoyed that they never have an index. Like,
they don't. Like, they do not have an index.
Well, I've got a copy of his erotism, and the index is like the smallest index I've ever seen.
Do you have the City Lights?
Yeah.
One. Yeah.
Yeah,
that was what I was first introduced to him, was the City Lights books.
Yeah. I had to read that for a continental philosophy course, and like I'd heard of Lacan and Derrida, and we did Marx, but I had never heard of Bataille before that class.
You know how I heard about Bataille? How I was reminded about Bataille? There's 2 interesting factoids about Bataille that I encountered in graduate school. And that was Lacan stole his wife, and he born and died on the same days as Faulkner, which just is weird. I don't have anything like I don't have any meaningful thing beyond that those are facts, but I don't want to think about the idea that like somehow Bataille is the French Faulkner. That gets even more fucked up. But and I think I read the Accursed Share on my own because I got interested in eroticism at a cafe. Just we were talking about, and it was definitely in Athens, Georgia. Now I think about it, and then I started reading him seriously when I was reading Continental Philosophy on Evil. As an upper level undergrad in continental and like general philosophy, I took a continental philosophy class, and there was a section on evil, and we read a bunch of Bataille.
His literature and evil essays are pretty interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I like that. There's that like one interview with him that you can find where he's talking about that book on just like a normal news like interview show.
Mm-hmm.
It's pretty fun because he's just like like this kind of like dumpy white dude in a suit, and the guy's just like, so are you saying that literature is evil? And he's like, well, yes. It's inherently wasteful to be a writer. You like no one, your parents never want you to become a writer because you're wasting everyone's time. Like there's something evil about it. That's why Kafka is shamed, and Baudelaire is Flowers of Evil and stuff. It's pretty fun to watch. He really does look just like a school teacher or something.
Yeah, he does. Yeah, he's always looked odd. Let me put it that way. For those of you who don't know what Bataille looks like, but you're watching.
Okay.
That's his face. I don't know who it reminds me of. He looks like a French Wallace Shawn in some ways.
Yeah. He definitely looks like he could be in some kind of stuffy like 50s drama.
Yeah.
Like a
Hitchcock villain.
Yeah, he looks like he could be in like a Hitchcock movie.
So make of that what you will. I mean, I'm just always fascinated, like when Simone Weil was hanging out with him and being like, "This guy's a weirdo."
I think a lot of people thought that.
It's just
one thing that I remember in Limits of the Useful, it talks about there's like a part in here where he gives like an acknowledgement to some dude that I don't think is well known outside of France particularly, but I can't remember which guy it is, but like he was friends with this like one other communist dude who I think was like a mathematician or physicist that kind of helped him with his ideas of like cosmic motion and whatnot. And the guy sort of like was his closest friend and helped him do Acetail and stuff. And then he kind of like got more distant and sort of like decided that he didn't really agree with Bataille's theories. And it sounds like Bataille was like throughout the rest of his life, he kept trying to get that guy to like get back in every time he published a book, he would send like a signed copy to that guy and thank him, and that guy just like never talked to Bataille again. Like there's no evidence that he ever like wrote back, and I'm like, I kind of feel bad for Bataille now. Like he wanted to keep being friends with this dude, and the dude was just done with him. But Bataille, he wrote a lot on friendship, wrote a lot of theories on that. It's a strange man.
Yeah, he's a man that it would seem like he'd be interesting to know, but not to know super well. Like, I might want to hang out with him for a few hours, but I don't think I want to be in his head. Like,
he'd be a good pen pal.
like H.P.
Like-
Lovecraft. I'm just imagining
Yeah.
Bataille writing H.P. Lovecraft like letters.
Yeah.
As long as you don't mind a little bit of virulent racism in your
Yeah.
otherwise interesting speculation.
Well, yeah, even in the last section, he's like, the Russians love to suffer.
Yeah. Yeah. That's something. I think that's one of the oldest stereotypes ever. It's like Russians
Yeah.
Russians suffer. That's what they do.
Yeah,
Like,
they're earthy people who suffer.
oh man, I would love any Russian listeners to tell us what you think of Bataille's opinion about you, or if you agree with him. So, oh man,
But yeah, I'm excited for volume 2/3. I do think it will get more wild.
I do too.
Hopefully, get back into shape after this disappointing conclusion to volume 1.
Yeah. Well, we're gonna end there. Thank you guys for participating. We will record again in the month, and this will be posted, and there will be more Bataille coming up. Then we're gonna move. I have no idea how long it's gonna take. We went through this Bataille book faster than I thought we were going to, but I don't know how long the volumes 2 and 3 are going to take, because it might be just as fast, or maybe we get bogged down in like every other essay. It could, both are possible with good old Bataille. You just never know. But then we'll be moving to Stanislav Lem's Summa Technologicae, which I imagine is going to be just as weird, but in a completely different way. So you have much to look forward for. Thank you guys for coming on. Thank all listeners. If you want more like this, we do other book clubs behind the Patreon wall, mostly on other stuff. Like, I don't know, how many versions of the Capital reading group are there now? Probably only one. There was at one point like one for volume 1 and one for volume 2 and 3. And there was a reading group on like other Marxist theory, and then there's the theory reading group where we just went through the Brenner debates, and I decided that I don't think anyone who said that book was really awesome read anything but the first and last essay. So that is my official take on the Brenner debates for those of you who want more behind the paywall. Thank you so much, and good day.